when you see it happening to children who don't have agency whatsoever about what they're exposed to, or whatever it is, you can see that people, start to sit up, and take notice.
Welcome to the Be Well podcast, wellness backed by science, bringing you inspiring conversations to help you on your wellness journey to a healthier, happier you. Brought to you by Breast Cancer UK. You can start your personal prevention journey right now by taking our prevention quiz. Just click on the link in the show notes. Hello and welcome to the Be Well podcast. I'm Thalie Martini, CEO of Breast Cancer UK. Now today I'm going to be talking to an environmental chemist and a professor at the University of Birmingham, who is also a member of the Centre for Environmental Research and Justice, as well as the Birmingham Plastics Network. Now, my guest's special interest is in POPs, not the grandpa kind, but rather the pollutant kind, otherwise known as persistent organic pollutants, as well as also an interest in microplastics. So these are areas which have a significant link to both environmental concerns, which we talk a little bit about at Breast Cancer UK, but actually more specifically for us at Breast Cancer UK, it's about the health impacts. So my guest's work is of particular interest to us here at Breast Cancer UK because of his focus on assessing and understanding how these pollutants and chemicals actually get inside our bodies. And it's something actually that he discussed with fascinating insight at our 2025 Breast Cancer Prevention Conference, which we'll talk a bit about some of the things that were discussed in that talk. But also he talks about understanding what happens to our health once they are inside our bodies. So this is all extremely relevant to us, and because we are one of the very few health organisations in the UK who are really working hard to understand what the links are to these exposures and potential breast cancer risk, as well as other health impacts. Lots to talk about with my guest, because it's not just about the research and what we can learn from it, but also about how it should help shape policies that regulate these pollutants, such as microplastics, flame retardants, a lot of terms and issues that we hear a lot about, and how they impact on our environment, but also how they're found in those everyday consumer products that many of us actually don't really know much about. So my guest is a rare breed, a reputable and talented individual who seamlessly bridges that scientific rigour with policy and advocacy solutions. This is an area that's we at Breast Cancer UK are really keen to really highlight. I can't wait for this conversation and also tap into the incredible knowledge and experience. So welcome, Professor Stuart Harrad. It's really great to have you on our podcast today.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. And of course, if you could see me, you'd see me blush. That was probably the best introduction I think I've ever had. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're extremely modest, but let's get straight into it. So, you specialise in microplastics and persistent organic pollutants, otherwise known as POPs. And specifically what you look at is that human exposure. So let's go back to the beginning, and I'm interested in knowing really what it is that led you into this particular field in the first place.
I think so. I was doing a degree that was an applied chemistry degree, which meant lots of conventional chemistry, so pharmaceutical chemistry, etc. But then in my final year, I remember we had a lecture series on environmental chemistry. And it wasn't related to POPs, but it was related to air pollution in Los Angeles and the causes of that and what the impacts of that were. And I just remember thinking, yeah, actually, this sounds really interesting, and it sounds something that I can try and make a difference in. So this was, 21-year-old me, I guess, sort of looking for some way in which I could be useful, without trying to put too much of a gloss on that. But that just resonated with me. I then, when I graduated with my BSc, I then did a master's in analytical chemistry, which in itself is not necessarily, that could go a lot of ways. But then I did a research project, which then led me to my PhD supervisor, who offered me a chance to work on a PhD, to do a PhD looking at dioxins, which is the sort of, kind of like one of the original POPs, or persistent organic pollutants. So that's really how it sort of started, and I guess the rest, is history.
Yeah, it certainly is. And as an environmental chemist, not a biologist, and your career really has moved towards a lot more conversations around human health. Is that something that you kind of expected in those early days? And how does it impact now on your science?
I think, as I said, if we go back to that sort of light bulb moment, 21-year-old me hearing about like air pollution. Obviously, one of the big sort of concerns with that, the real driver for that, in the way that they were talking about it, would be the effects it had on human health. So really, right from the start, it's been about, actually, this can't be right. We shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. This is having adverse impacts on human health. So, and if we go forward then to look at my PhD with dioxins and related chemicals such as PCBs, really from then on, it's always been driven by concerns about human health. And what we're trying to do is to say, okay, what's the dose that people receive? So like a toxicologist, an epidemiologist would kind of say, okay, if you're exposed to this much, if this much of the chemical is entering your body over a period of time or whatever, then this is what the health impacts might be. And so, but what they can't tell you is, are you being exposed to that level? Are you exposed less, or are you exposed far above that sort of level? So that's where we come in. It's more exposure assessment, and say, okay, in total, then you're being exposed like above this level, or in a lot of cases, okay, it's fine, safe. We can move on from that. If we find a situation where someone, or we think a sector of the population has been exposed above that level, it then also becomes very important to understand how it's happening. And so, for example, is it coming via skin exposure, which I know we'll get to later on? Is it coming via our food? And if it's coming via food, are there particular types of food that contain more of these chemicals and give you a higher dose? Is it coming from outdoor air? Is it coming from indoor air, etc.? And if we can say, okay, well, like 90% of it is coming from this particular source, well, that's the thing. You can go to a policymaker and say, right, this is what we need to target, because if you put your resources into that, then you're going to get the maximum bangs for your buck. And that's really important, because I think we do also have to be realistic about the resources that policymakers have to try and make changes. And I'm mindful of that. So working with people like in government agencies. So I've had some good relationships with people like over the years. And you have to be realistic. In an ideal world, we tackle everything.
Yes.
But that realistically, is not possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll get on to the specific area of science that you look at. But the fact that you, as a scientist, you're thinking, okay, well, how can my scientific research actually translate into policy? Do you think that makes you unique? Because, I think we have this image of scientists who have, they're kind of in their space of research, and it's research, not just for research's sake, but, it takes a lot to think, well, I'm going to research this so that I can have a purposeful conversation with a policymaker. Does that make you unique in that space?
I don't think it makes me unique. I think there are lots of people who do it and lots of people who will do it better than me. Some people might not do it quite as well as me. I don't know. I think it also depends on the area that you're in.
Yeah.
So there has to be room for science which is blue skies and doesn't necessarily have any obvious application, because you often find out things that do have applications for it later on, that kind of thing. I would say that certainly through the last 20 years of my career, that funding agencies have increasingly put as a requirement, if you're going to get funding, that you consider the communication, the dissemination, the public engagement aspects. And so, for example, I'm involved in evaluating 2 research proposal calls for the European Union right now. And that's a big thing, that they want to say, okay, how are you going to communicate your results to the general public, and how are you going to communicate it to regulators, for example? So how, is your research going to have some impact beyond the pure, academic findings that you might have? And I think that's something that I've always had in mind, but I've wanted to think, actually, and it goes back to what I'm saying, that first moment when I first thought about it. It's like, right, well, I'm doing this stuff. I'm going to be a chemist. What impact is that going to have? Am I going to feel useful? Yeah. And I think that's really important, that you can say, actually, our research has had some impact, has had some meaningful impact. It doesn't have to be sort of huge. We're only sort of, one person. But if you can say, actually, maybe I've just changed something, even if it's just a tiny bit. And I think that happens in all walks of life. I mean, if you're, serving somebody a coffee, if you do that in a polite way, you give someone a smile, you've made somebody's day better. So you've had an impact. So we can all do that.
And it gives you that kind of focus and purpose. But let's talk about specifically your science, because this has been an area really that we've had a great interest at Breast Cancer UK. You spoke last year in 2025 at our breast cancer prevention conference, and actually there were over 100 delegates, loads of speakers around the world, and you were able to bring your research area to this audience, and it was quite a mixed audience, people who were talking about both kind of some of the environmental risk factors of breast cancer as well as lifestyle risk factors. Did this in any way help to put your work into perspective within a wider context, being able to be part of that conference and peers who themselves were looking into, say, causes, but from different perspectives?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, absolutely. I find those conferences are sort of, great, because I think it does help put your work into perspective. And you get people coming in with viewpoints from a different perspective. And they'll go, oh, this may be a stupid question. And let's be honest, sometimes you are thinking, maybe it wasn't, okay, I can answer that pretty quickly. There isn't such a thing as a stupid question. But there are also quite a few times when you go, actually, I hadn't really thought of it in that way. And obviously for me as well, I learned a lot about, the etiology of breast cancer, for example, and some of the other risk factors. And I can remember I was messaging my wife and, sort of my 2 daughters about it as well. Did you know this? Because I didn't. And I mean, hopefully a few people got something a little bit like that about mine. But I think there was some really, interesting things there. And I think, again, I think we'll talk more about the collaborative nature of science sort of later on. And I think increasingly people are realising, that scientists, that you need to collaborate and to look across the disciplinary boundaries sometimes.
And that gives you that kind of, you're able to step away from the microcosm, I suppose, of your research area to see this collective, the diversity, I suppose, of
the
research perspectives.
The problems we're looking at are very complex. They're complex problems, and therefore they require complex solutions quite often that involve a lot of different people. And so, for example, you could say, okay, well, we may come up with a strategy that's really going to work, but how are you going to put that into practice? How are you going to get the public communication? How are you going to get people to buy into that? How are you going to get regulators to not only to buy into that, but how do you effectively regulate as well? There's all
it's really complex. Let's drill down into the actual detail of your work. So your research, you use 3D skin models to assess the extent to which chemicals can be absorbed in the skin. So you mentioned earlier on that there's, it's about how do we get that exposure. So looking at a skin as a way of absorbing these chemicals, what you found was that the skin could be a significant source of exposure for some PFAS. And when we talk about PFAS, some people might prefer to call them forever chemicals because that's how they tend to be better known. And we know that PFAS often contain endocrine disrupting chemicals, so EDCs, which can affect our hormone system, potentially also increasing breast cancer risk. So can you maybe talk us through some of the common ways in which we absorb PFAS through the skin?
Well, I think it would be, if you think about it, it's going to be via like products that come into contact with skin. So we know that PFAS have the potential to be present in like outdoor clothing, for example. And they're there because PFAS are generally used in that sort of situation because they're both waterproof and stain-proof. So if you think about it, if you have some clothing and it comes into contact with your skin, it's also you're wearing it for some time, it's prolonged contact. So clothing, for example, would be. Quite often you'll find in sort of furniture, particularly in sort of like public situations, the sort of fabrics will be stain-proofed. And you can kind of understand why people might have that. And certainly I had the experience maybe 10, 15 years ago when we were buying a new car and the salesman offered us, some stain-proofing for our car. My wife said I was a bit too vehement in my refusal of that because I'm pretty sure that, particularly at that time, that PFAS would definitely have been involved. So things like Scotch Guard, but people would be very familiar with that back in the day, would certainly have contained like PFAS. There are, rather scarily, like cosmetics, for example, that contain PFAS. Again, we have to qualify that with the fact that there are relatively few PFAS for which we have really good evidence for adverse effects. And that small number, is dwarfed by the number of PFAS that we don't know what the effects are. And there are, like an awful lot of those. So you can get PFAS free, like cosmetics, because I know that because we looked for some in order, in terms of our experiments, because we wanted to look what the impact of putting sort of, like moisturisers on the skin might have on the extent of the uptake through these skin models, for example. So those just some examples of how you can be exposed via contact with the skin.
And they're pretty much everyday kind of situations for people. So functional situations. It's raining, I'm going to wear waterproof. I put moisturiser on my skin. And just quickly on the cosmetic, the PFAS-free cosmetics, are they often labelled as PFAS-free, the ones that you refer to?
My understanding is they are. I don't look for cosmetics myself too often. But certainly I know that the PhD student, Odni Ragnarsdottir, who did the work, she went out and said, yes, we definitely, have these. And so she was able to do those. So she was very, good in, sort of searching those out.
And so going back to the actual science, so you use these 3D skin models. Does it allow you to really effectively replicate that real life human exposure scenario?
Yeah, well, we believe that it does. If you think about it, there are ethical concerns with actually using real humans to test out the dermal exposure. There is one study we know of in Germany where a medical doctor experimented on himself to look at that, which I think it would be hard to get that through, I think, in the UK system. And we wouldn't, and so traditionally, what was used in the past would have been like animal skin models, leaving aside the ethics of that, and that's something that we made a conscious choice that we weren't going to go down that route, like at all. Leaving aside the ethical implications of that, does rat skin? I mean, how well does that match up with human skin? People would say, but there are some some similarities with that, but it would leave you open to questions about that anyway, just from a scientific point of view. You can use what they call ex vivo skin, which is skin taken from people's surplus skin after like plastic surgery. So you can get that. Again, there's ethical considerations, but you can get sort of ethical approval for that. And so what we did, we got hold of some of that. And then we compared the results we had with using the ex vivo skin with these 3D human skin equivalent models that we have, and we found the results were pretty much the same, and certainly we sort of backed up our use of these. So these 3D human skin equivalent models that we're using, the in vitro ones, they they're commercially available. They're not cheap. They're probably about €3,000 a throw to get one of these, but they have a long history of being used in the pharmaceutical and the cosmetics industry. So there, what they want is to see, okay, we have an active ingredient. So if you have an ibuprofen gel, if you're a pharmaceutical company, you want to know, does it get across the skin? Because that's what you want to happen. And so we had the idea that what we would do is like, hey, maybe we could use these for chemicals that we don't really want to get across the skin and see what would happen. So we've maybe been working in that area for about 10 years or so now. Right.
And so these chemicals that you were looking at in terms of being absorbed through the skin, they're found, you've already talked about some of the things they're found in, so flame retardants. You talked about stain resistant stuff, but also flame retardants, waterproofing, water repellents, and even sunscreen. And I think one of the interesting things as well, and this was covered in the the recent BBC documentary Panorama, which you were featured in, is that what you have found, and this would be interesting to explore, is that they're designed to protect us generally, the public from harm. So harm from flames, harm from, sun exposure and so on. But actually what was alarming, something that you covered in the documentary, is that it featured information around exposure to PFAS levels in, say, children's raincoats. Do you think, first of all, that the British public, outside of your whole kind of academic and regulatory sphere, do you think they have a general knowledge about these products? And do they understand that they can be maybe not as safe as we would hope? And what general response have we had to this Panorama documentary?
I think, frankly, that the general public are, just not that aware of that. There will be people who will have more of an interest in sort of what they're exposed to in things. But generally speaking, people won't be. And I kind of understand that, because I think we're all getting along with our own lives. We have lots of other things to be sort of thinking about. And I think there is a sort of implicit sort of belief within people that no one's going to put stuff in that might possibly harm us. And I think that there is that until people see evidence otherwise. And sometimes you just find the dam suddenly bursts and suddenly people are outraged about these. So if we look at sort of children's articles, the furniture fire safety regulations in the UK are quite different to elsewhere in Europe, other than in the Republic of Ireland. There, a lot of children's products are treated with flame retardant. So the cot mattress, we found maybe 10, 20% of some of these chemicals by weight being present in these. They're not banned, but they are there. The manufacturers of those chemicals would say that, what they're added for is to meet the furniture fire safety regulations. There is now, I'm not quite sure where we are with the legislation at the moment, but certainly the draft revision of the regulation, which is definitely as a result of research that we've done and other people, is that a lot of children's products will be removed from this because there was no real need. There wasn't the fire risk that you might have.
Compared to the risk of exposure.
Yes. I mean, indeed. So, for example, if you have like an adult mattress, the idea would be people that would fall asleep after maybe a cocktail too many, smoking. Therefore, there would be some sort of rationale for it. You can have a separate argument about that, but I can see some sort of rationale. But, for example, we had in baby changing mats, you had these chemicals present. Obviously, it had been flame retarded. I mean, is when your child is having its nappy changed, is it lying back there with a cigar, going, "If you could just wipe me down there, please." That's a flippant way to sort of treat it. But they really, to my mind, we did a study where we said, right, the risk of exposure far outweighs the fire risk is there. So do we need to have these? And so the legislation certainly was being put forward to be changed and to remove those.
And that's real world impact that that's a perfect example of the impact of your research.
I'm just very excited about that. But I mean, that's 10, 15 years of research. And I'm not trying to claim it is just us. There's a whole wealth of people out there who've done that, and all my research group as well. But
what a perfect case study of what it takes actually to translate that research into policy change. And I suppose to some extent when it impacts on young people and the evidence, or children, and the evidence is strong.
I think naturally as a society, I think that people, when you see it happening to children who don't have agency whatsoever about what they're exposed to, or whatever it is, you can see that people, start to sit up and take notice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, what's troubling here, what you've just described, is that we have a policy in place that's designed to protect children from, fire safety policy to protect children, that feels like it was ill thought out, almost kind of a blanket approach, because fire's a problem and therefore we'll just have a blanket approach, without assessing the potential harm of that policy, And so it's your kind of science that steps in and says, well, actually, if we're balancing, the risk of fire and potential other harms, the balance isn't there. And use of these chemicals and the potential harm to children is far greater. And the public's just not aware of that. Do you think there's a change in the public understanding of this now, thanks to some of the work that you've done?
I think we've got a long way to go with that.
Yeah.
And I think just in general, what I would say is what we need is a sea change in the way we need to have a population that is scientifically literate. I'm not saying that you have to be a scientist, but I think you have to I think people would go, I just can't understand that. They will just switch off. But I think we need to get a scientifically literate population, and that has to start at school. I think it needs to be put through in the way that we, educate people about, how you test things in a way, sort of like a scientific hypothesis, and how to weigh up evidence. That could probably apply to an awful lot of things. I'm not sure how we could do that, but I think that we should be doing more with that, because I think that people simply just switch off
Yeah.
I think it's very easy for people. And sometimes there is, the fatalistic approach as well, it's...
Well, information overload, when it's too alarmist, people will turn to the fatalistic approach.
Yeah. And also I do think if you look at sort of, like newspapers, they will have, oh God, if you do this, then this is going to happen, etc. And then you have conflicting evidence coming later on, and it's just very difficult. And I think people do quite honestly just think, well,
what can I do?
Yeah, what can I do?
We're all stuffed.
Like if I do that, then I'm doomed. If I do that, so
yeah. That is a challenge, isn't it? And then, of course,
challenge.
we're talking about products that are mostly really convenient. So very convenient products. So
it's like
a raincoat.
Stoneproofing. Well, stoneproofing. I would say that I think people are more likely to go, actually, stoneproofing, maybe I can live with the odd stain. I can get it and scrub it off. So that's where, like the PFAS, the safety, like stoneproofing aspect, is more easy, I think, for people to go, I don't really need that. Fire safety is a different kind of thing. People would say that, and that's where people say, well, like we need to have these chemicals because they save lives. And there's been a big debate there amongst people, sort of fire safety scientists. Some saying, yes, well, the evidence supports that you need to have these things and they're very effective. But equally, there's a large body of them that are also saying like the opposite, that really, they don't do that much good. If there is a fire, that actually when they burn, they then change like chemically and generate other chemicals, which are probably more harmful.
Yes.
So again, that isn't my area of expertise, but I know enough about it to know that there is a significant debate as to how useful these chemicals are in terms of it. So.
And then there's the whole kind of high, the high fire risk jobs. So people who work in these professions, like firefighters, for example, and what all of this research means for them and their safety. And I know there's a lot of debate around, these jobs are essential jobs. The firefighting is an essential job, but are they being, exposed to higher levels of chemicals such as PFAS? And how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence that I've certainly seen quite a few studies that point very much to the fact that firefighters do have higher exposures to a lot of these chemicals. Of course, they're also exposed to a lot of other things because, they're obviously going into buildings that have a lot of smoke, and because of that will then generate a lot of like chemicals that can cause like cancer, for example, as well. So I think there it's about what the like epidemiology might tell you as to what the actual causes of those might be. But for example, I'm certainly aware that some firefighting uniforms that I've heard about in the States would have high concentrations of PFAS in them, for example. And if we go back then to the work that we've done on dermal exposure, you're having someone who is then having direct skin contact at elevated like temperatures for a prolonged period of time. So that is obviously going to increase the potential for exposure. What the health impacts of that might be, of course, is more difficult to tell. And that's where you need good epidemiology to come in. Yeah. But certainly there are studies on some evidence that's emerged, for example, from the US, which is certainly points to the fact that firefighters do run like a greater risk.
So we've talked about kind of the exposures through skin, but there's a lot more to your work as well. There's other pathways that you look at, and some of the obvious ones are things like the air that we breathe. So Breast Cancer UK, we're really interested in this area as well because, again, the potential links between air pollution and breast cancer. And I think, when people think about air pollution, they're thinking about those particles that we inhale when we go out from kind of exhausts, and pollution in the air outside, traffic and so on. But in your studies, you look specifically at what we inhale and the chemicals that we inhale indoors, like inside our home or, in offices. Can you give us a little bit of insight into that study and what you found?
Yeah, I think looking at indoor air is something that we've looked at for 25 years or so for various chemicals. For a lot of these chemicals, probably the main exposure pathway for a lot of people is via the food we eat. And if you look at what's outdoors, because there's such a vast volume of air and there's winds blowing things around and diluting things, actually the concentrations tend to get diluted and therefore lower. We also find that a lot of the sources for the sorts of chemicals we're talking about, like PFAS, because they're present in products we use indoors, or like the flame retardants, the same sort of thing, the sources where they're being emitted from are indoors. And then if you think about it, how much time have you spent today outdoors?
Much less than I've spent indoors.
Yeah. So I think, as a rough guide, probably a typical person in a sort of northwestern European country such as the UK would probably spend something like 10% of their time outdoors. So little. 90% of your time is spent indoors. So when you couple that for these chemicals, where most of the sources are indoors, and also the fact indoors you emitting the same amount of chemical into a much smaller volume of air, it doesn't get diluted as much. No. So we've done lots of studies that show you get maybe 10 times or maybe 20 times, 30 times higher concentrations indoors than outdoors. When you then couple that with the fact that you're spending 90% of your time indoors, it rather dwarfs what's happening like outdoors. But then this comes back to this exposure assessment. We can say, okay, well, for these chemicals, right? So outdoor pollution with it isn't going to be too much of an issue. Indoor is more, but actually, probably more important is going to be food. It depends which chemical you look at, and it can vary. For different chemicals, sometimes the way that the chemical is, some chemicals will evaporate more readily into the air, and therefore air exposure will be more important. Some chemicals like PFAS can be soluble in water.
Right.
Therefore, drinking water can become important. Whereas for these flame retardants, it's usually they're not very water soluble at all.
Talk to us about the drinking water, because there's been lots of things in the press about certain areas, certainly in Europe and here in the UK, where people have been advised not to drink tap water.
Yeah, I think if we're looking specifically here at PFAS, then for most people in the UK, and this is we have published a little bit of data on it, and we have some more data that's likely to be published relatively soon, which actually shows that in drinking water from taps and from most bottled water samples we looked at, the concentrations of PFAS are within what we currently think are safe levels, which is reassuring. So it does suggest that, like drinking water isn't going to be a problem for the general population. But there are locations within the UK. So there's Jersey, where they found elevated concentrations in drinking water. There's Bentham, for example, and so those are just two examples that I can think of, and I suspect there are others. What's happened there is that there's been an incident that has contaminated the local groundwater supply. So, for example, if it's near an airport, the firefighting foams that have historically been used there contained these like PFAS chemicals that will then leach through into the groundwater. And if the local population is reliant on that groundwater as its water supply, which is what can happen in some communities, then they are going to be their drinking water will be highly contaminated with PFAS. In those situations, then this can be a really important pathway of exposure, can exceed what you might get via diet. You might also as well have a situation where it contaminates sort of local soil. So if you're then sort of growing, you had allotments, for example, then that also might mean that local sort of crops might be contaminated.
Wow. So we've talked about skin exposure, air exposure, and obviously eating, what we eat and drink, which you've just said is quite significant in terms of getting exposure to PFAS. And actually, we talk a lot about this as well, because, a big thing that we do at Breast Cancer UK is about providing people with information, education. So we talk about using safer cookware, such as cast iron, stainless steel pans, avoiding single-use plastics where possible, because they all of that can help reduce exposure to PFAS. But you've recently done some research on the role that temperature plays in things that we drink, for example, and how that has the potential to release microplastics from packaging, let's say, directly into beverages. Can you tell us a bit about that study? And are you hopeful that this kind of study will help with the kind of future risk assessment when it comes to the whole public health interventions?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, if you think about it, it makes sort of logical sense that if you try and stir in like some sugar into a cold cup of tea, you might do an iced tea. It will be much more difficult to get that soluble. Raise the temperature, the chemical, the sugar, dissolves much more easily. And so that's really what you're seeing happen with if it's like some chemicals that might be present in the plastic. The microplastics themselves, it just makes it sort of, I think if you have a sort of new product, things are more loosely bound. And so when you first put something in, you'll get more coming off. It's a bit like if you have like a new carpet at home. To start off with, you're getting new carpet fluff everywhere. Maybe a year later, because it's been used a lot, most of that easily friable fluff has disappeared. And it's the same with the sort of heat. The heat will sort of help it, dislodge like the particles, like from like the plastic. So that's really what is like happening there. I think what it argues for is that try and avoid using sort of one, like single use, like plastics where you can. I hold my hand up today for my lunch because I had to come down. I'm traveling. I forgot to bring my water bottle with me, so I've got a plastic like bottle. I will keep that. I will try and use that a few more times at least to be able to do that. And I know it's difficult because there's things of convenience there, but trying to sort of minimise that single-use plastic is good from an exposure point of view. It's also the right thing to do, like environmentally. We need to avoid like plastic use as much as we can, and to reuse those bits of plastic that we do use. And
go back to that temperature point. I mean, and the whole kind of wanting to recycle. We know that there's, we use a lot more, for example, reusable cups now as opposed to disposable cups. But how do they compare in terms of that potential kind of exposure? The reusable cup, the disposable cup, because they both are going to have heated products in them. Do we understand the difference between the two?
I don't think we do properly yet, but if you ask me for my working hypothesis, I would say at the outset, there's probably not much difference.
Right.
But I think that over time, because you're reusing it, those bits that dislodged in the first use or whatever. So maybe there's an idea. When you get that, they often say rinse, wash them a few times, beforehand, before you start to then like consume things from them. If you've got a reusable one, that would be something that would make sense. Another thing that I should just go back to is that people often ask if there's a way you can, simple ways to reduce your exposure.
Yes.
And so with PFAS, the way that I would say from our research points out at the moment would be to filter your water before you drink it. So we've published a study which shows that you're getting 85-90% reduction of the PFAS. And there's only PFAS we've looked at. My hypothesis would be that it would work for a lot of other chemicals. So these, like activated carbon.
Yeah, I was going to say, what kind of filters? Jug filters.
Yeah. So those ordinary, sort of like jug filters. We've used them at home for a long time because the water is quite hard, quite chalky. It would fur up the kettle, etc., or fur up, the coffee maker. But actually, it also does a very good job, like removing all sorts of other chemicals. We've not looked at how the efficiency drops off with time with that. But I would say that if you change them according to the manufacturer's instructions, which is once every 4 weeks or so, then you should still be getting a pretty good reduction. That, of course, is only going to reduce your exposure via water.
And you've got the other exposures in the home. What are some tips for that?
Well, I think do as I did when you're offered stain-proofing treatments on anything, just, refuse them. I think you have to then just be prepared for the fact you're going to have to be on your hands and knees scrubbing, like stains off. I think at the moment, furniture is still going to have to meet fire safety regulations. And you can get products which are like flame retardant free, which still meet fire safety regulations. You don't need these chemicals to do that. But because they're still quite niche, the cost is much higher. And so I guess there's a bit of an environmental justice issue there, and the fact that, there's sort of, middle class people, such as myself, I have to, but we could, afford, like to buy those. But the average person hasn't, got them. You're going to buy, the least expensive product you can, but does the job, that you want it to. So I think, there has to be a sort of shift away. And an interesting thing they've done, I remember being in California, having a sabbatical there about 7 or 8 years ago. And there, they changed the fire safety regulations. They didn't say you couldn't use, like these sorts of flame retardant chemicals to meet the fire safety regulations. But what they said is that you've got to put a label on which says that this product contains chemicals that is deemed by the state of California to cause adverse health effects. So if you could use them as a manufacturer, but if you did that, you had to put this
Not great promotion.
So I think it kind of put the boot on the other foot. It sort of put the proof, put the burden of proof on, like the vendor, rather than on the consumer. And I think maybe that is an approach that you can look at. And if you look at something like REACH, the sort of EU,
the regulatory system,
which was meant to put the burden of proof, on the
and it's certainly how the EU REACH has been designed, using the kind of precautionary approach, which is the burden of proof is on the manufacturer. To some extent, we're seeing less of that in the UK since the UK's started to construct its own REACH.
The regulatory sector in the UK has been overwhelmed.
Yeah. I think that's the way of describing it, isn't it?
That has been, put on them, because of, the exit from the EU.
I know, and that's a whole other discussion. But not having that kind of centralized support, the data available, that's what it is. It's resulted in the framework in the UK being overwhelmed because effectively they're starting from scratch.
Yeah.
Just on this kind of advocacy piece, you are a member of the Birmingham Plastics Network, and this is a cooperative which is committed to sourcing sustainable solution to the plastic problem. And there's so many angles angles to this problem. You know, we talked about how, I suppose, inequalities, poverty can play a part really in increasing exposure simply because we don't have the means to go and get those alternative products. And then, of course, we've got the whole regulatory system and how that works. Do we put the burden of proof on the industry and so on? But it'd be good to hear about what this network is all about, and also if you tell us a bit about how the collaboration is really important in helping assess the chemical exposure risk.
Yeah, well, the Plastics Network at Birmingham looks at a whole range of issues related to plastics. I think probably, fundamentally would be to find more sustainable ways in which we can produce products. And some of those may involve plastics, the more conventional fossil fuel-based plastics we might have. Some of them, and a lot of them, there's a lot of research, they're looking at how we can use different sorts of polymers. So they would be like bio-based polymers, for example, that can degrade, that can be degraded. They can be recycled more easily as well. So that is, I think, a very important aspect of that. Where I come is more looking at there's so many chemicals that are used as additives, for example, flame retardants, PFAS, plasticizers, for example, as well, which again are big cause concern in terms of their endocrine disruption effects. So we're looking very much there. If you produce lots of plastics, then you've got all these chemicals that go with them. So there's those aspects. They're then, of course, saying, okay, well, we're all working at our lab benches, etc., about that. But actually, then we have people from the legal aspect and also from the humanities, the social sciences, like the psychological sciences, then saying, okay, well, how do we get messages across to people, to make a difference? How do we communicate these findings? How do we get them into regulation? There's an awful lot of things that go into that, and so it's a really fascinating thing to be involved in.
Yeah, and you talked earlier on about how you're about to go to the EU to share some of your evidence, and that you'll have policymakers there keen to listen to you, and in fact, even those funding models encourage you to work towards that. Do you have many of the same opportunities here in the UK?
Yeah, no, I'm sit on the UK government's Hazardous Substances Advisory Committee, so we can feed into that. The work that I was talking about before, where the furniture fire safety regulations have been reviewed and are looking to be changed, that was the sort of paper where we ranked the relative risk of exposure to chemicals compared to the fire risk in various articles, including childcare articles. That was some work that was conducted, funded by the UK government. We do have opportunities to do that. The funding bodies in the UK, equally, push, and in fact, it's an essential part. If you don't pay sufficient attention, to those aspects, your science might be great, but you're not going to get it funded. So you have to do something about that. And I think universities have cottoned on to that as well. We have people there whose job is to help us geeky scientists to actually be able to communicate things and to be able to meet up with regulators. I think some people are more open to that than others. And I think that's naturally just a personality thing as well, I think.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges that we are conscious of in the policy landscape is that, and your work sits really at the intersection of this, and that's between the human health question and then the kind of health of the environment. And from a policy perspective, it's very difficult to see that synergy and to talk to those policymakers. So we talk about regulation, and that kind of sits here and is fairly distant from the kind of policy policy, the health policy that's being developed. But the two are, intrinsically linked. And I suppose my question to you is, how can we use this kind of joint mission to both unite health and environmental advocacy so that we can, I suppose, have the impact that we need, particularly from a policy health perspective? Because from a policy health perspective, there seems to be very little discussion around how the regulation of these chemicals can impact on long-term public health.
Yeah, well, I would say if you look at the United Nations Environment Programme Stockholm Convention on POPs, which is how POPs are regulated internationally and therefore feeds into UK and EU regulation, one of the criteria for a chemical being designated as a POP and therefore subject to regulatory control is its adverse impacts on human health and the environment. So I think, there is already that sort of recognition. And if you think, I would say that if something has an adverse effect on the environment, then it is almost by definition going to have an adverse effect on us, like as a species. So and even if it isn't immediately obvious, then you find those knock-on effects happening. So I think if you look back at something like DDT, which is one of the original POPs, in the first phase, it's great. It's sort of been used to sort of reduce populations of mosquitoes and sort of but ultimately that has then had adverse impacts on other species which we didn't want to adversely impact. And because we didn't know at the time, but it has ended up bioaccumulating. And we're still finding, I'm pretty certain if we took a blood sample from either of us now, we would still find a legacy like of DDT that would be present, like in our bodies. So these things, I think, there is that principle of, like One Health, which sometimes is, it's... cancer, like a bit of a cliche, but I think there's there is it covers like a fundamental truth that more and more I think that we understand that everything is sort of linked. In the old days, we used to think if we emitted a pollutant, then it would go outside, it would be dispersed and diluted in the air and job done. Or you release it into a river or the sea, sewage, for example, no problem. It would just be diluted. But what we see is that isn't the case. Chemicals can be released. So we used to release sulfur dioxide from our coal-fired power stations in the UK. Over time, that reacted. Sulfur dioxide went into sulfuric acid and maybe was then causing sort of like acid rain and like forest death in northern Europe and southern Scandinavia, those sorts of things. So we slowly have learned about these things. Yeah,
and I suppose those are very high impact events that have a clear health impact. What's insidious about PFAS and other chemicals like endocrine disrupting chemicals is that they're invisible. There's little public perception. There's also a lot of work to be done to really understand the impact on health. And so from a health policy perspective, they just don't appear anywhere. So if we look at the cancer plan or the 10-year health plan, there might be a bit of an indirect kind of nod at environmental factors, but that's as far as it goes. And so I suppose, we're progressing when it comes to regulations from, an environmental perspective. But at some point, we're going to have to start to acknowledge that some of the health conditions that we're seeing today are likely to be impacted by these. And what are we going to do from a health perspective to address those? Just as a little aside, we do health talks. We go out and talk about breast cancer prevention in companies. And I was talking to an insurance company. And when I started talking about some of the information we share around endocrine disrupting chemicals and how we're concerned that it might be linked to breast cancer risk, I was approached at the end of the talk by somebody saying, it's it's really interesting because we're now writing health policy and we're baking in this question around PFAS. We're looking at how chemicals might be impacting on health and therefore could have an impact on these insurance policies. And I'm thinking, well, the insurers are ahead of the game.
No, that's true. Yeah, I've heard something. Like similar. I was at a conference on PFAS in Berlin in last October. And one of the people, I gave a talk about how we're exposed to PFAS, not just dermal, but the whole sort of overview. And one of the people who came up to speak to me was someone who used to be a researcher in that sort of area, not PFAS per se, but in that sort of environmental area, but was now working for an insurer because they're thinking down the line. Probably one of the things they're thinking about would be, the risk of litigation.
Totally,
against the producers of, like various chemicals.
Yeah.
But yes, no, it makes, like absolute sense.
So it's interesting that the manufacturers, on the one hand, they're obviously interested in continuing to use these very convenient chemicals for their products. But on the other hand, they're foreseeing that there could be some issues down the track. So the insurers are starting to gather that knowledge as well. So
indeed.
It's interesting how the industry itself will kind of lead us to have a better understanding, I think, as well. Well, look, we're almost out of time, but I know you've talked about some top tips, but I do think it's always handy for our listeners to, be able to have some real practical advice. And what would you say to our listeners should be something, if there's one or two things that they should do to reduce their exposure to PFAS, what would they be?
Well, that first one would be use that jug filter.
Yeah.
It's very simple to do. Yeah. And I think you could use that as well to make sure that the water you've then used, like to cook with, would also be much reduced in terms of like the PFAS. So I would always say that was a very good idea. I think that if you use like cosmetics, look for PFAS-free like cosmetics. I think that would be a very good way of doing things. Again, avoid things that are stain-proofed. I think it's something where you have to think, well, do you really need that? And for me, it's a personal choice, but I think you have you can make that choice yourself based on informed like knowledge. If it's a stain-proofed like product, then it is more likely. It's quite likely it will have like some PFAS in. The convenience of that is.
But it doesn't feel as necessary or hard to kind of disentangle yourself from as some other things that include these chemicals. So that's great. All right. Well, we've moved now to the last part of our interview where we want to find out a little bit more about you. And there's a question we ask all of our guests, and that's, we are kind of a health podcast. So we also like to know what people have in terms of their own interests. But in your case, what I'm interested in knowing is if you do have a guilty pleasure, what is your biggest guilty pleasure?
It would be a caipirinha and probably flying, because I've done a lot of flying, which I suppose as an environmental scientist you think, I'm trying to cut that down. So we're going to France this weekend, so we're taking Eurostar, and if I go to Brussels I always take Eurostar now, and we're travelling down to Seville for a cooking holiday next October, but the plan there is to do that slowly and go down via train. It costs a lot more. And again, this is something that it is like a middle class thing that you're able to do that. But the flying is a guilty pleasure because I kind of know there's some adverse environmental implications to that, of course. But it's enabled me to meet so many people. I've done, a lot of it, has been like through work, but I've had a great time whilst I've done that. There's been some, and you get to meet a lot of people, and I think, it's sort of great. And I love making cocktails. Yeah. And I was in Brazil last June, so there were a lot of, the caipirinhas.
Yes, that is a real guilty pleasure because one of the things we talk about as well is alcohol as a risk factor. So, and there are great non-alcoholic versions of all of these.
Well, indeed, indeed. So the last couple of nights, my wife and I have had a non-alcoholic Paloma, which is normally a tequila-based one, but there is a non-alcoholic agave spirit. But you can get,
any good?
It's good, it doesn't work so well in like a margarita.
Right.
Because the alcohol, at least to my taste, just has something. There is a taste to alcohol that you don't realise until you take it out. But in terms of like a Paloma, it really works well. No, definitely.
We have another guest who would really debate that, because she's someone who's a mindful drinking person who has come up with some amazing recipes, and I'll share them with you.
Well, I would like to see the recipes because I would be very happy, because I made margaritas. Yeah, it was good. Don't get me wrong, but it wasn't. Whereas with the Paloma, it worked.
Great.
Treat.
Well, I'll share with you her name is Mindful Cami, and she's one of our ambassadors and she is brilliant. And
I genuinely would be very interested.
Her cocktails, and she doesn't call them mocktails because she takes it very seriously.
No, that's right.
Non-alcoholic cocktails are brilliant. Anyway, books, podcasts, films, anything that you really like to listen to or read that you want to share with our listeners?
Now, given that this is a podcast, I have to say I don't really listen to podcasts very much. My wife does, so she may well now listen to this. And in fact, of course, I will now, of course. I'm a great sort of music listener. I play in a band.
Do you? Right.
But I think if you're looking at sort of work-related one, I would say obviously the movie would have to be Dark Waters.
Yes.
Which is a very good film, and I recommended it to sort of first and second year undergraduates because, it was good. And in our house, so my wife is a lawyer, my eldest daughter's a lawyer, so it's a good sort of like legal thriller with something about environmental chemistry. So it was perfect viewing for the Harrad family. And I guess if I was going to look at a book, I think I probably would go back to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which was published the year I was born. So again, maybe that was destiny, that I was always going to be working in this sort of field.
But it's scary to think that book that was so ahead of its time, the knowledge was there, the discussion was there, but today, have we really progressed?
I would argue that we really haven't learned, because things that she was talking about with DDT, for example, we keep producing similar chemicals that we know are going to bioaccumulate, that we know are going to have adverse effects. And she didn't even really, I think at that point, really sort of know how much it was going to impact on humans. But if you're going to impact on one species, you normally are going to have impacts on others, and ones that you hadn't foreseen originally.
Look, thank you so much for your time. Very quickly, where can listeners find out more about you?
Well, obviously, you will just have to Google me, which is the usual way of doing it, because I couldn't really recommend it, think of something, obviously. Otherwise, there is another podcast, actually, which there's an episode of, and it is called PFASology.
Okay.
And there's an episode there on dermal exposure to PFAS, which is where the student who conducted the work, Odni Ragnarsdottir, talks about that. There's a whole load of other ones, because this was a big EU project with 15 PhD students across Europe, all worked on aspects of the PFAS issue.
Great.
So PFASology.
And not to forget the Panorama documentary as well.
Oh, indeed, of course,
which was called, what was it called?
I can't remember.
It was all about
embarrassingly,
PFAS.
I can't remember,
But that's another area. Thank you so much for your time. It's been brilliant and fascinating to talk to you today.
Wonderful to meet you. Thank you very much for the invite, and good luck with the work. It's great work you're doing.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Be Well podcast, brought to you by Breast Cancer UK, a prevention charity supporting people to build healthy, lifelong habits and reduce their risk of developing breast cancer. You can start your personal prevention journey right now by taking our prevention quiz. Just click on the link in the show notes.